You must manifest complete love and affection toward all mankind. Do not exalt yourselves above others, but recognize all as your equals, recognizing them as the servants of one God. Know that God is compassionate toward all. Therefore, love all from the depths of your hearts. Prefer all religionists before yourselves. Be filled with love for every race, and be kind toward the people of all nationalities. Never speak disparagingly of others, but praise without distinction. Pollute not your tongues by speaking evil of another. Recognize your enemies as friends, and consider those who wish you evil as the wishers of good. You must not see evil as evil, and then compromise with your opinion, for to treat in a smooth, kindly way one whom you consider evil or an enemy is hypocrisy, and this is not worthy or allowable. You must consider your enemies as your friends, look upon your evil wishers as your well-wishers, and treat them accordingly. Act in such a way that your heart may be free from hatred. Let not your heart be offended with anyone. If someone commits an error and wrong toward you, you must instantly forgive him. Do not complain of others. Refrain from reprimanding them, and if you wish to give admonition or advice, let it be offered in such a way that it will not burden the bearer. Turn all your thoughts toward bringing joy to hearts. Beware, beware, lest ye offend any heart. Assist the world of humanity as much as possible. Be the source of consolation to every sad one. Assist every weak one. Be helpful to every indigent one. Care for every sick one. Be the cause of glorification to every lowly one, and shelter those who are overshadowed by fear. Abdu'l-Baha.
Thank you. So this week, our speaker is Mr. Michael Orona, and his topic is A Shared Humanity Between African Americans and Indigenous Peoples. Mr. Orona has served in the U.S. Department of State for over 20 years, where he has held an array of senior-level foreign policy advisory positions in Washington, D.C., and various countries around the world. In his years of government service, Michael served at the White House as National Security Council Director for African Affairs, where he oversaw the formulation of the U.S. Africa Strategy. While serving at the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam, Michael negotiated the release of 3 prisoners of conscience. In 2004, Mr. Orona established and led the State Department's Sudan Atrocities documentation team, which was dispatched by former Secretary of State Colin Powell to investigate the violence in Darfur. In 2020, Mr. Orona was selected to serve as Senior Advisor for Strategic Global Policy in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where he oversaw implementation of the President's executive orders on advancing racial equity and promoting gender equity. In 2022, he was selected to concurrently serve as the State Department's Senior Advisor for International Indigenous Rights. In this current capacity, he serves as advisor to the department's Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. Mr. Orona represents the State Department on the White House Council on Native American Activities, co-leads the White House Subcommittee on International Indigenous Human Rights, and works to ensure U.S. foreign policy protects and advances the rights of Indigenous peoples across the world. Aside from a Juris Doctorate degree in international law, Michael received an MS in Military and Strategic Policy Studies from the U.S. Marine Corps University, Command and Staff College in Quantico, Virginia, where he was awarded the Foreign Area Officer Association Award for exceptional research in international affairs. He's a recipient of 5 U.S. Department of State Superior Honor Awards and 3 Meritorious Honor Awards. He's a member of the Chihene Membreno Band of Apache and of Yaqui ancestry. He currently lives in the DC area with his wife and 3 college-age children. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Mr. Orona.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon and good morning to those on the West Coast. I want to thank Armin and Baha'i Faith Modern Perspectives, first and foremost, for the opportunity to join you and for giving Indigenous peoples a platform to share our thoughts and perspectives. Now, it is customary for Native peoples to introduce ourselves in our native language. So let me start by introducing myself in my father's language of Apache. Inde biate danejo, inde nishli dishi asan shije. Ina biate Michael Orona shije. Shema nakayiyo me yaki hike shita chehen inde. Again, my name is Michael Orona, and I thank you for joining today's presentation. I'm honored to be here today. Just before we begin, I just want to state that, as it mentioned in the introduction, I am a U.S. government official, but the thoughts and ideas expressed today are my very own as an Indigenous person of Yaqui and Apache ancestry, and as a member of the Alexandria, Virginia Baha'i community. The ideas expressed today are not official U.S. government policy. Also, I want to take time, since I am in Northern Virginia, to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral lands of the Anacostia, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey peoples, and we honor their elders, past, present, and emerging. Selena, we can start with the first slide. And the next one. Thank you. Now, I am originally from the southwestern United States. I was born in Arizona, and I was raised in New Mexico from Baha'i parents of Apache and Yaqui ancestry. I come from a long line of Indigenous storytellers, writers, artists, scholars, and poets. Most of my professional experience has been focused on promoting the rights of historically marginalized people around the world, advancing the rights of human rights, racial equality, social justice, and advancing the principles of gender equality. Now, briefly, for those that may not be familiar with my mother's people, the Yaqui, most are familiar with my father's people, the Apache, and the famous Apache of the Southwest, such as Cochise, Geronimo, Mangas, and others. But for those that are not familiar with the Yaqui people, my mother's people, I've added a slide here, and I thought a brief introduction would be helpful for folks. Now, the Yaqui are traditionally from northern Mexico and southern Arizona, and the tribe has lived a life of resistance, first facing Spanish conquistadors, and later the Mexican government, the Mexican government that enslaved members of the Yaqui tribe, enslaved them to work the sugarcane and tobacco plantations thousands of miles from their traditional homeland. This was under, of course, brutal conditions. The government forced Yaqui women to marry non-native men in an effort to destroy the indigenous culture and way of life. Over 2/3 of the Yaqui slaves died within the first year of their enslavement due to the harsh conditions. The Yaqui would continue to fight for their rights and eventually receive land recognition in 1939. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't share the photo of my grandparents on the slide in the bottom right-hand corner, or my great-grandparents, rather, and my brother is also included on this slide as the Yaqui deer dancer. Next slide, please. Now, before we examine the historical shared humanity between Indigenous peoples and African Americans, I would like to briefly share what the Baha'i teachings say about racial equality and the unity of humanity. From its inception in 1863, the Baha'i community has been dedicated to the principle of the unity of humanity. The principles of racial equality and unity are central to the Baha'i teachings. In fact, Baha'is from all over the world are dedicated to establishing a global civilization guided by the principles of the oneness of humanity and attainment of unity and diversity. As Baha'is, we believe the elimination of racial prejudice is the most pressing issue of our time. The Baha'i writings state, and I quote, it's also there on the screen, "The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until unity is firmly established," end quote. Next slide, please. Now, as we explore the shared humanity between African Americans and Indigenous peoples, I believe it is important to first understand the effects of racism and how it prevents members of all communities, again, members of all communities, from achieving their true potential. On this topic, the Universal House of Justice, which is the supreme governing institution of the Baha'i faith located in Haifa, Israel, issued a powerful letter in July of 2020. Now, the letter was in response to calls for social change and racial justice that took place in America during that time. This was sparked by the death of George Floyd. Now, in the letter, the Universal House of Justice defines the effects of racism, and I'd like to read a quote from that letter. I quote, "Racism deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while belighting the progress of the rest of humankind. It cannot be rooted out by contest or conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all." And once again, I want to thank everyone for participating this afternoon, because I believe that is why we have all gathered here today, to build and fortify these just relationships in our communities in order to uplift all. Next slide, please. The Baha'i writings state that the complete transformation of society necessitates the ability to harness the power of all people. Now, as highlighted in the previous slide, not allowing for a diverse discussion of thought by diverse participants hinders humanity's ability. It hinders our own community's ability to achieve its collective destiny. Now, for far too long, I would say, I would offer as an Indigenous person, that Indigenous people have been noticeably absent, excluded, and marginalized from this important conversation. Furthermore, I would state that society must not categorize Indigenous peoples as historical figures whose time has passed, but instead look to Native peoples, and I use this quote on the screen, as a significant element in the spiritualization of humanity, the construction of a unified world, and the establishment of a global civilization, end quote. It is my hope as an Indigenous person that Indigenous people and members of the African American community will find areas of collaboration, together play a more active role in this dialogue, and help America, help our communities achieve its true destiny. The time has come, I would say long overdue, for members of these two communities to actively participate, to lead and collaborate in this important conversation. And I truly, truly believe that all of us, that we will all greatly benefit from this new perspective. Next slide, please. Now, in taking a historical view of the shared humanity between African Americans and Indigenous peoples, it's important to acknowledge that historically, one of the very first individuals to publicly acknowledge the prominent role of Indigenous peoples and people of African descent in the United States was not an American. Instead, it was a man named Abdu'l-Baha, who was born in Persia and lived from 1844 to 1921. Abdu'l-Baha was the eldest son of the Prophet Baha'u'llah of the Baha'i faith. As Baha'is, we know that Abdu'l-Baha was not a manifestation of God, but is seen as an exemplar of how we should conduct our own lives. In 1912, Abdu'l-Baha traveled to the United States, and during his visit affirmed that America had a special mission and contribution to make in world affairs. This special destiny, he said, would be, and I quote, propelled by the transformative spirit and principles of the Baha'i faith. This includes the elimination of all forms of prejudice, the equality of women and men, universal peace, and the independent investigation of truth. Now, it was during his visit to America in 1912, in support of the rights of people of African descent, that Abdu'l-Baha urged audiences in New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, Los Angeles, other places throughout the United States. It was during this talk to an audience of over 1,000 white and Black participants at Howard University in Washington, D.C., that Abdu'l-Baha urged the audience to confront what he called the most challenging issue: racial prejudice. It was during that talk that Abdu'l-Baha also called for racial integration in that same speech, again at Howard University, 40 years before the historic U.S. Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education. Abdu'l-Baha stated that by confronting racial injustice, America would fulfill its special destiny to lead all nations spiritually. Next slide, please. In Abdu'l-Baha's support of the prominent role indigenous people will play, Abdu'l-Baha stated, and I quote, "Attach great importance to the indigenous population of America. Should they be educated and guided, there can be no doubt that they will be so illumined as to enlighten the whole world," end quote. This was Abdu'l-Baha's message in 1915. Now think about this. 1915 is when Abdu'l-Baha offered this message. This was at a time in U.S. history when boarding schools were being used by the U.S. government to forcibly assimilate Native American children. Native American children were forcibly taken from their families, not allowed to speak or pray in their native language. The motto of the day at that time was "Kill the Indian and save the man." Now, we are all too familiar with the beatings, the sexual abuse, and untold number of deaths that took place at these boarding schools at that time. And I would add that Abdu'l-Baha's recognition of indigenous peoples also came at a time when Native Americans were not even citizens of our own country. Native peoples, Native Americans, would not be U.S. citizens until 1924. Now, here is a man born in Persia, delivering a profound message in support of my ancestors and generations to come, in support of indigenous peoples, in support of the powerful and prominent role indigenous people will play in enlightening the entire world, not the region, not the country, but as he says, the entire world. And I would further add that Abdu'l-Baha used every opportunity to engage in a sustained and a very public challenge to the racial ideologies that supported the color line in American life. It's important to emphasize that this is something no other prominent visitor to the United States had ever done. This is a truly, truly historic moment in support of people of African descent and indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. This idea that long-term sustainable change must take place by spiritual transformation was also taken up by previous generations of civil rights champions. This includes Dr. Alcee Austin, who's there on the screen. Now, Dr. Austin was the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Cincinnati School of Law, the first African-American woman to serve as Assistant Attorney General for the state of Ohio. And she would then later go on to represent the NAACP in its fight for state funding for segregated schools. Dr. Austin lived a remarkable life. And she also tried to teach us that the battle we face, and I quote, the battle we face is essentially spiritual, to transform the souls and spirits of human beings, end quote. Since the battle is spiritual and guided by the words that I shared earlier by the Universal House of Justice, again, that all segments of humanity must express the full range of their capability, we must welcome all people to collaborate in a sustained and a concerted effort to create a new framework for justice and equality. Next slide. So why is collaboration between people of African descent and indigenous peoples so important? So important to the future of this country? First, again, I would go back to the Universal House of Justice to quote, that every individual and support from all members of society and all communities are needed to overcome this vital and challenging issue. Underscoring again that preventing a segment of humanity to express or achieve its full capability is detrimental to the rest of society. Also, as Abdul Baha mentioned, America, when it would truly confront racial injustice, it would fulfill its special destiny. America would fulfill its special destiny to lead all nations spiritually. Now, if America is to achieve its special destiny, to lead all nations spiritually, as mentioned by Abdul Baha, I would offer my own opinion that two of the greatest spiritual traditions going back to the founding of America, again, going to the founding of this country, two of the greatest spiritual traditions come from the African American community. And with great humility, I would offer my own indigenous community, Native American community. The reason I say this is there are unmistakable spiritual traditions found in both communities that go back countless generations. Each community, African American and indigenous communities, have a historically strong belief, acceptance, and conviction in the existence of a divine or a supreme creator. Within both communities, for the most part, there is an unmistakable faith in the power of prayer, invocation, supplication, and also an unmistakable and very distinct respect for the ancestors and elders and those that have gone before us. And I would add what is truly unique is how these two spiritual traditions in the African American and indigenous communities seamlessly intertwine their unique cultural and spiritual traditions so that cultural and spiritual traditions carry that same belief through music, song, and prayer. Now, also, these two communities, as we know, are forged by historical hardships. Both communities, African American and indigenous communities, have had to transcend unspeakable violence and horror. The transatlantic slave trade, forced displacement, assimilation, and genocide. But I would add that there is also a shared humanity, a historical intersection, a historical intersection between African American and indigenous peoples that has been ignored, forgotten, or erased to our own detriment. And I truly believe when we fully understand and learn to appreciate, to acknowledge the powerful spiritual forces that exist in both the African American and indigenous communities, when we truly understand, acknowledge, and appreciate this, our nation will be better for it. Now, in the Baha'i writings, there are many powerful and profound quotes on the promotion of racial equality, on social justice and unity, and I've shared a few with them with you earlier. However, I want to focus on a particular quote in the Baha'i writings that states what is required to bring about the oneness of humanity, what is required to overcome discrimination, and what is required to overcome prejudice. Next slide, please. Thank you. What is required is an inescapable obligation to nurture, encourage, and safeguard every minority belonging to any faith, race, class, and nation within it. Now, the inescapable obligation is central to the Baha'i writings, and I believe central to bringing about the unity of humanity. I would add that self-reflection on the inescapable obligation is necessary for each person to understand how each of us can best contribute to creating an inclusive and equitable global society. This might include encouraging or the act of looking for opportunities for other members of marginalized groups to be invited to serve in a greater capacity, not merely as a token or a symbolic role. This might include stepping aside to encourage another member of society. And I believe that this will allow us to all greatly benefit from a new and diverse perspective. Now, I would like to highlight a few examples of this inescapable obligation. Again, the selfless and courageous acts to protect and promote other members of humanity. Now, far, far from a perfect history, members of the African American and indigenous communities have what I call a shared humanity, a historical intersection, again, that throughout U.S. history has been ignored, forgotten, or erased. And I want to be able to share a few historical examples of this shared humanity, of this historical intersection. Next slide, please. I believe it's important to first highlight this historical intersection found here in the United States. This is between members of these two communities, again, the African American community and the indigenous community. So just a brief bit of history. In May of 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. Now, the act forcibly removed and destroyed long-established communities of indigenous peoples from the southeastern United States. Now, as we know, this would be known as the Trail of Tears. Now, most experts agree that 70,000 to 100,000 native peoples, again, were forcibly displaced, and thousands upon thousands perished on the forced march due to disease, due to exposure of the elements and exhaustion. Now, with the forced displacement of Native Americans, the United States was setting itself to serve as a global superpower with the support of, at that time, its most important natural resource. That important natural resource was cotton. Cotton production increased rapidly after the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and this set off a historic economic boom for the United States. Cotton would be produced in regions of the United States where Native Americans once lived, but were now displaced. So at the time that indigenous families and communities are being destroyed and forcibly removed, cotton would be cultivated by slaves brought to America from Africa. As one group of people are forcibly being removed from their native land, another group of people are being enslaved from their native land. Now, I highlight this piece of American history not to create division, not to find fault, but again, instead to realize the historical intersection of these two groups, the beginning of a shared humanity, a shared history. Now, I want to share a few examples of how these two communities put into practice, again, this inescapable obligation, the ability to encourage, to nurture, to safeguard, to support another member of a distinct community outside of our very own. And here are a few examples. Next slide, please. Now, a few examples again of this important, very important inescapable obligation. In 1934, the Crisis magazine, which is there on the screen, the Crisis magazine was the official publication of the NAACP, and it was once edited by W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1934, the magazine referenced the Trail of Tears in an article, just as I just mentioned the history. It mentioned the Trail of Tears, and you can see there's a quote on the screen. Now here in 1934, again, is the official magazine of the NAACP. The author, who is African-American, makes a historical reference to the injustice faced by Native Americans, a community outside of his very own African-American community. The author, however, is moved enough to share the tragic history of another community outside of his very own. Now, I find this remarkable, given the circumstances members of the African-American community faced at that time, again, in 1934. This was a time of Jim Crow, racial terror, segregation, facing members of the African-American community. But the author found it necessary to highlight this important segment of Native American history. Next slide, please. Now, the story of a shared humanity and courageous acts of this inescapable obligation can also be understood through Native American oral traditions, also through slave narratives, and also from documents written by white settlers. They all support these historical accounts of coexistence and cooperation between African Americans and Native Americans during the time of the Underground Railroad. Now, many of the routes that slaves took on their way to freedom was in close proximity to known Native American settlements. And again, I would say this is for obvious reasons. A major thoroughfare for freedom seekers making their way north through the Midwest ran through dozens of Potawatomi and Ojibwe villages. Now, one example is the family narrative of Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson was a former slave whose family and others escaped slavery from Kentucky to Canada in 1840. Now, avoiding slave catchers and bounty hunters, Josiah and his family found themselves in the heart of Indian country in the state of Ohio. Josiah would later describe how at that time a community of Native Americans fed them bountifully and gave them a comfortable and safe place to sleep for the night, safe from the bounty hunters and slave catchers that were following them. The next day, according to Josiah, male members of the same Native American tribe accompanied the group until they were safe and then could take a vessel across Lake Erie to freedom in Canada. Now, I find this to be amazing, but this is absolutely not the only historical reference of this kind. There are many others. And then what I would note is what is usually not mentioned in U.S. history is that slaves also found refuge in Mexico. There are similar historical accounts of indigenous peoples helping slaves find freedom also in Mexico. Next slide, please. Now, it is important to also underscore that indigenous peoples and African Americans have also collaborated on an international scale. In 1911, author and activist, again, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Charles Eastman. For those not familiar with Charles Eastman was the first Native American to graduate and be certified in Western medicine. And there's a photo of him there on the slide. Now, these two men represented the United States and their respective communities at the Universal Racist Congress. This was held in London, England, again in 1911. Now, the objective of the International Congress was to bring about like-minded individuals from around the world to discuss racial prejudice and the effects of colonialism. Both men, both presented papers on how African American and Native peoples could usher in an anti-colonial future and the importance of racial equality. Also need to highlight, very important to highlight, that Abdu'l-Baha was also invited to speak at this very same event. Unfortunately, he was unable to participate. However, Abdu'l-Baha did send a letter in his absence, and I've included a very short quote from Abdu'l-Baha's much more detailed letter that was shared with participants. And the quote from Abdu'l-Baha on the screen is, "Consider thoughtfully the continual integration of the phenomenal universe. Unification and constructive combination is the cause of life. Disunion of particles brings loss, weakness, and decay." End quote. Again, a quote from Abdu'l-Baha. Now, some might dismiss the URC, the Universal Racist Congress, because it was a one-time event. It only took place one time in 1911. However, I would say this was a remarkable first step, a groundbreaking first step. It set a path by African Americans and indigenous peoples working in collaboration to expand awareness that racism in the United States and the ability to achieve unity was not solely a domestic issue. In fact, it was now seen as a global issue that needed a global solution, a truly global vision. I would underscore that as Baha'is, we believe the case for world peace is directly linked to success in resolving the issue of racial injustice. Thanks. Next slide, please. Now, there are indeed many other examples of the shared humanity, examples of the inescapable obligation demonstrated by African Americans and indigenous peoples that have truly inspired other groups and other movements. This includes movements and groups going back to the 1960s, going back to the 1970s, the Black is Beautiful movement, the American Indian movement, which was established because of the growing number of police shootings on reservations. These movements also, inspired the Chicano movement, the People of Its Land movement, all the way to the more recent, and I would say long overdue changes by a certain professional football team in Washington, D.C. that finally removed its racist name and mascot with the support and the collaboration of both Native Americans and African Americans. Now, for the sake of time, I want to highlight and move to a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who also acknowledged and spoke of the racial inequality of a distinct community outside of his very own. Next slide, please. Now, here is the quote from Dr. King, and it states, "Our nation was born in genocide when it enshrined the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Long before there were a large number of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in the battle over racial superiority," end quote. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Why We Can't Wait, 1964. Again, I raise the issue of a shared humanity, not only to encourage members of both groups, African American and indigenous peoples, but members of all communities to truly reflect on our integrated past, this shared human experience, and work for a unified purpose for the betterment of all people. Next slide, please. Now, in conclusion, in June of 2021, the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, which is the supreme body that oversees the American Baha'i community, they wrote a powerful letter again in June of 2021, highlighting the important role members of the African American and indigenous communities must play. And here's a quote on the screen, and I will read this quote. It is crucial that, in particular, the African American and indigenous believers of this country arise and take their rightful place at the forefront of this work. The services of African American and indigenous brothers and sisters will be instrumental to the growth and development of a truly just, inclusive, and unified society in this land, end quote. I would say a perfect summary. My professional life for the last 20 plus years has allowed me to work with a number of wise, thoughtful, and truly courageous individuals on a number of very difficult and troubling issues around the world. One of these remarkable individuals was Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Next slide, please. The Archbishop was a true human rights and social justice icon, and I remember him always offering a quick word of advice with a wonderful smile. And there he is again, smiling. He seemed to be able to get to the heart of an issue with a few simple words. And on the role of a unified humanity, he offered, a person is a person because they recognize others as persons. Final slide, please. The Baha'i writings state the fundamental solution to racial and ethnic conflict rests on the common recognition of the oneness of mankind, end quote. I truly hope that we can all move beyond our own personal limitations, experience, and limited understanding to achieve this selfless, courageous display of the inescapable obligation and truly appreciate our shared humanity. Under tremendous circumstances, members of these two communities, African American and indigenous peoples, whether again through the written word or through courageous physical acts, displayed the inescapable obligation that is central to the Baha'i writings. I would say that what is demanded of all of us today is that same courage and love of humanity that Abdu'l-Baha spoke of, acted upon, and encouraged the early American community to have in order to overcome racial prejudice. Again, this most vital and challenging issue. And with that, I thank you for your time and turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking on such an important topic. We really appreciated it. So if people have any questions, they can put it in the chat now.
On the screen, I see many friends and family, many indigenous families that have paved the way for all of us and on so many issues.
As a historian, how can I forget the past as recommended by Shoghi Effendi?
Wonderful question. I would say that it's important to acknowledge the past, right? We can't forget the past, and we're asked to acknowledge the past. We have a wonderful history in this Baha'i faith of ours. We have stories of courage. We have stories of fulfillment, and that are truly inspiring. So we need to remember that history that we have. And it's important to remember the history of this country and the difficulties that we've gone to. But it's truly a balance. It's truly a balance to not hold on to the horrible history that we've had, but truly work to inspire, to change the trajectory of our country, to truly inspire and be part of a solution, to be part of a social transformation, to be part of community building, And again, as I mentioned, the previous quote from the Universal House of Justice, this doesn't happen by conflict or opposition. It comes building cooperation, building frameworks of unity, of justice, and working together. So we have to acknowledge our history, but we have to work for a new world order, for a new vision.
Thank you. Can you please speak about how you feel America will arrive at the goal of racial justice and race unity?
Oh, it's a big question. Yeah, my own thoughts on that. The inspiration for doing this talk and the inspiration for doing the research behind this was because I truly believe, again, we go back to the quote by Abdu'l-Baha, we look at the wonderful quotes by Dr. Austin and how this is a spiritual solution, how a spiritual solution is needed. I truly believe that our country needs to look to all people to be part of the solution, but I truly believe it needs to look to the history and the spiritual contributions that exist between the African American community and the indigenous communities, two early communities in the founding of this country that played an important part in this founding of this country. And I believe they will play an important part, an important role in the spiritual progress of this country. And there is fulfillment yet to happen. And we see the wonderful and powerful words of Abdu'l-Baha for both of these communities.
There's a lot of people who are sharing that they loved your talk. What aspects of Native American beliefs would be best to introduce as a similar belief in the Baha'i writings when we introduce the faith to a Native American seeker?
I think first and foremost, and I wanted to share this in the history. Great question. I wanted to share this in the history. I did say that during the time that Abdu'l-Baha in 1915 used the quote, the profound quote of the prophecy, the fulfillment that Native Americans will have in bringing about a new order. It's important to recognize that this happened during a very difficult time in American history, a very difficult and dark time facing indigenous peoples in this country. We have to, when speaking to our Native American brothers and sisters, our indigenous population, and I just want to highlight, there are over 400 million indigenous peoples around the world. Okay, so let's be mindful of the globe and how many indigenous people, 400 million around the world that are recognized as being indigenous. It's important to understand and recognize and to teach that as Baha'is, we don't lose our culture. In fact, we are supportive of that culture. In fact, we are asked to share that culture, to be part of that, to put it at the forefront of who we are as Baha'is. For too long, indigenous peoples, not only in this country, but around the world, have been forced to assimilate, to forget that culture, to do away with that culture. But here is a new faith, the Baha'i faith, that calls for people to keep that culture.
Do you feel America will achieve race unity through suffering, or will people wake up on time? Are people waking up? How can we tell? What do we need to do as Baha'is to promote race unity?
Great question. I do believe it is changing. And I have this sense that it's changing not just in America, but I have this sense it's changing all over the world, because I'm seeing, and it could be in my position working on indigenous issues around the world, I see this new era of indigenous peoples coming forward, being part of the solution. For far too long, indigenous peoples were told, were not consulted in these important discussions. And we are here, we are part of the solution, need to be part of the solution. These communities have agency, they have always had agency, and need to be part of that conversation. And I hope through this talk, people will realize that of the important role that Native communities need to be part of this discussion. And if we don't, again, it's to our own detriment, and we're repeating history.
How do we make our community at large aware of this crucial challenge facing us globally, and that without race unity, we will not have peace?
I think it starts locally. I think it absolutely starts by working with like-minded groups, working with community organizations, working with other religious organizations that are working on these very same difficult topics and trying to create a new world, trying to create a better world for all of us. And I just want to add, this is not anything that others don't want. And I believe I would just point to a quote in the Bible, Matthew 6:9-13. It says, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, that will be done on earth as it is in heaven." This is a promise of the Bible of building this new order. It's the same as in the Baha'i faith. There's a quote by Baha'u'llah, and it says that which God willeth shall come to pass, and thou shalt see the earth even as the most beautiful Apa paradise. Very similar. These are things that we all believe in, that we are all aspiring to. We just need to work together to find that relationship, collaboration, building communities, mutualism, working through cooperation, building dialogue.
How should Native and African Americans react to the current open borders with invasion by tens of thousands of military-aged men?
Mary, I'm sorry, border question on what was the last part? I didn't catch that.
How should they react to the current open borders with invasion by tens of thousands of military-aged men?
I'm assuming this would be the borders in the U.S. Mexican border.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. I was in a meeting in Ottawa with Indigenous peoples from the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and it was so interesting because there was talk again about immigration. There was talk again about open borders, closed borders. What is right? What is wrong? And once again, we failed to include these indigenous communities that live on these borders. I believe there are 50, maybe over 50 sovereign Native communities on the U.S. Canada and the U.S. Mexican border that go across both borders. And we have yet to include them in this conversation and consultation. And again, we pay for this at our own, it's at our own loss to invite them to be part of this solution. They have lived in this region of the world for countless generations and know better what is needed in those parts of the world. So we have to include this. It's about consultation, as we know, inviting them to be part of this solution.
Baha'u'llah referred to people of African descent as the pupil of the eye, which is dark in color, yet it is the fount of light and the revealer of the contingent world. And Shoghi Effendi said that the natives of the great American continents will become great standard bearers of the faith. In your reality, what can whites and Persians do to engage, embrace, and love more historically significant populations into our communities?
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful question. Great question. It goes back to the quote that I used from Shoghi Effendi. It goes back to this idea of I don't want to use the word empower, but to acknowledge and to invite members of these both communities to be active participants, to lead discussions on these issues, to actively lead conversations on these issues, to be a part of this consultation, to actively join together. And this may include, as I mentioned in the talk, this may include others to step aside and to invite others in their place. This may include inviting Native peoples of African descent to be part of programs, to be part of talks, to be part of these conversations, to lead these conversations, because we've missed out for far too long. And I would encourage members of the Baha'i community to do that, to look for these opportunities. And again, not for not as a token, but as a true consultative process to hear directly from these peoples. We've had these quotes from Shoghi Effendi. We've had these quotes from Abdul Baha forever. We've failed to acknowledge. We've failed to achieve this. And now I would very much stress that now is the time to use this opportunity.
What are your views on the growing trend of anti-white racism?
Not helpful. Not helpful. As I mentioned, the Baha'i faith, we need all people. We need all people. And I shared to our own detriment, again, I shared the fact that we have failed to truly include indigenous population, truly include the African-American population and others. And if we don't include all segments of humanity, we're bound to fail. Only including one, whatever that one is, or only including a couple is to our own detriment. We have to include all people, but we have to do it in a way that we are consulting, that we are inviting people to be part of the process, to be part and actively contribute, actively lead these discussions, not just again, not in a token manner.
Who has the authority to bring racial unity? Individual, community, government, or institutions? What are the means and tools to bring change?
I think it really, to me, I work for a government institution, and I hope that someday that it will be part of that solution. And I think it is. I think it's definitely most helpful. But I see the more I travel the world, my 20 years working around the world, I see that it comes from these grassroots initiatives. It comes from these grassroots organizations. It comes from the people themselves who have the power to create change, have the power to express themselves, express concern, express solutions, and be part of that process of consultation. I would say again, the power to me, it stems from the grassroots organizations, grassroots and people, communities.
In the Baha'i faith, we believe in intermarriage as a means to promote race unity. Given that some indigenous peoples have been oppressed and forced to marry out, do you or they feel differently about this? Do you feel the need to marry in order to preserve the existence of your communities and identities?
I don't feel the need to marry from within. I think the beauty of it is to be able to share that culture with others, and to be able to truly create a tapestry of humanity with others, and to be able to. The key is to be able to keep that culture, the language, and the beauty is to be able to share that more widely, and that happens through interracial marriage. That happens by meeting and being part of new communities. That happens by new families, and the beauty and the power that are part of this. There's a very large African American, Native American community that exists. There's that we yet to tap into. There's a beauty, there's a power, an innate power in these, in building these wonderful new families, a new society of different cultures and languages. And again, we are asked to keep these cultures and languages and protect them. And I believe that's what is important.
Can you please define what is meant by indigenous peoples and where such peoples are located?
Yeah, indigenous people. So I would say, we refer to Native peoples or Native Americans, those that are from this country, this region. But indigenous peoples would be global. Indigenous peoples, you're looking at according to the United Nations, over 400 million indigenous peoples. The majority of indigenous peoples, in fact, live in the Asia Pacific region. This would include communities in Asia. This would include Quechua communities in South America. It would include Mayan communities communities in Mexico, Central America. It would include the Sami population in Europe. There's an indigenous population in Europe that we need to remember that exists, and so many others throughout Africa and around the world that are part of this. And again, it goes back to this idea of this power that exists that we have yet to tap into. 400 million people that exist, that are on the front lines of climate change, that are on the front lines of gender equality, that are on the front lines of political issues, that face these every day of their lives. And how important and how powerful can this be to engage these peoples in the reality that they live in and be able to communicate and make them part of this global solution. It's in our global interest to look to these people, these 400 million indigenous peoples around the world, as we are one global community.
How do we start at the grassroots?
I think by being a good neighbor, by being open, by talking to people in your neighborhood, wherever you live, by finding opportunities to assist and to be of service, to find like-minded organizations where we can make a change, where we can help bring our perspective, a new perspective. It talks about, it's about building friendships. It's about truly just building friendships, listening and learning.
In the Baha'i faith, we talk about crisis and victory. Can you please address these processes in relation to race unity and justice?
Crisis is what we're facing. Crisis is what we're facing. I think we've seen parts of victory. I think we've seen small inklings of victory. Some of the inklings that I've shared with you, this very small light, the Universal Racist Congress. Here's something that was established in 1911, and you have a profound, a prominent African American and a prominent Native American participate in this. I think this is absolutely remarkable. This is a success story. But this is just so small. This is a tiny bit, and we get these small glimmers of hope and how powerful they can be. Abdul Baha, although not able to participate there in person, was part of this process by no accident. And so we see these successes, these victories, right? But right now we're facing a crisis. There's a crisis amongst us everywhere, not just in this country, but around the world. And we have to remember what that success looks like and be part of that, be actively part of that process.
I hear and agree discourse and consultation are key. Please speak to how to create inclusive economies, Native American and African American homeowners and business owners in this country.
Absolutely, without a doubt, a discussion, a dialogue that needs to be established, that needs to be at the forefront of policy and progress, and isn't happening. Again, this is to our own detriment. This is where we have failed to include members of these two communities to be part of this process, to be part of the solution. And this affects all of us. It truly does, socially, economically, in so many ways, in so many other ways, educational, without these opportunities to truly consult, to have these members of these communities collaborate, lead conversations on these important issues, and it affects all of us. And we have failed. We need an opportunity to be part of these conversations. And this is why I believe talks like this are important, and questions like that need to be asked. So a very powerful question. Thank you for that.
Are there Baha'is from different Native American tribes?
Most definitely. Most definitely. You have some beautiful faces amongst us today that are there, and others that are not. And the reason they're not, because they're probably doing some great work today, teaching the faith or building communities. I've had the pleasure of meeting so many across the world, and not only here in America or Latin America, but just around the world, and truly inspired by the work that these communities do, these individuals do, to bring about a new world order. And I just have to say, the resilience of these communities and these individuals is amazing, given the history that our country has gone through, and the history of the horrible history that these families and individuals have faced. They continue to rise up. They continue to lead. They continue to be resilient. And I have nothing but honor and praise for these families, these individuals.
What do Native American prophecies say about peace?
Oh, that is a talk in itself. That is a talk in itself. There are so many prophecies that come from so many different tribes and regions of the world, but they are out there, and they are truly reflective of our culture. They are truly reflective of this wonderful faith that we have, and that is indeed a conversation that also takes place. And I will give credit to my brother Roman Orona, who does very similar work on that type of conversation. So if you want to look for him, he's out there as well, doing these same types of presentations on that. But absolutely a fascinating and inspiring topic within itself.
What opportunities to speak of the Baha'i faith are there in your UN work?
It's actually U.S., so I work with the U.S. government. But again, I use the quote, from Matthew. I use the Baha'i quote. There are people out there in all religions, all society, all communities that want a better unified world. They want peace. They want a balanced climate. They want to be part of a solution. They want a truly global vision. They want to be included. And there's so many people that are out there that are working for this. So it's truly inspiring to be part of this process, to be able to work with individuals outside of the faith, within the faith, and others, organizations, other religious traditions, cultures, to be part of this process. Truly a human, a global network, a truly a global vision, and I'm very honored to be able to do that.
Thank you. There are people who want another talk about Native American prophecies. I'll actually point out, we did have your brother on our program a while ago, so I can link that video. It's about Native American prophecies, but we'd of course love to have you back as well, to further talk about these things.
Glad to, absolutely glad to.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all of our questions. Thank you so much. That was a really great talk. We learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll continue to watch and share this video afterwards.
I thank you. Thank you for your support and technical assistance, and Bayan and everyone. Thank you all. Appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone, wishing everyone a safe weekend. And thank you for making time on a Saturday to be with us and take part in this presentation. So I'm very honored, and thank you all.
Thank you so much. So our speaker next week will be Mr. Verbis Counts. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time. So I'll put the link to our YouTube channel and our mailing list in the chat. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye.